Okay, morning everybody, and welcome to this session from the Bristol Poverty Institute conference on poverty and the sustainable development goals from the local to the global. This session will be looking at creating impacts on inequalities, partnering with charities and campaigning organisations. My name's Lindsay Pike. I work at Policy Bristol at the University of Bristol, and the team I work in works with academics to create impact from their work. I use a breathing technique to manage a stammer, so please bear with me, and I'll be chairing the first half of this session. My co-chair this morning will be Eloise Meller, who's an impact development manager at the University of Bristol. Before we start, a few words of housekeeping. This session will be recorded and posted on our YouTube platform and embedded in the Bristol Poverty Institute website. So by attending, you're consenting to being part of this recording. Please make sure that you have added your name rather than being listed as guest, as the BPI team will be monitoring attendees, and we also need to know who will be asking questions of our speakers. We'll be spending about the first 30 minutes with a structured discussion with our excellent speakers to introduce the topic. And in the final 30 minutes or so, we'd like to invite you to pose questions to the panel. You'll be able to ask questions via Zoom's chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Please let us know if you'd like to direct a question to a particular speaker. And if you'd rather ask a question verbally, you can raise your virtual hand and then Eloise will call on you to unmute. Because of time constraints, we might not be able to answer every question, but please feel free to get in touch with us after the session to carry on the conversation. And lastly, please be respectful. All events at this conference are being monitored, and we reserve the right to remove any attendees whose comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. So in this workshop, we'll be exploring how researchers, charities and campaigning organisations can work together to create change in policy and practice on inequalities and poverty. There are some fairly big questions to cover around this issue, which touch on the ways in which research can create impact, the types of evidence we need to support change, the importance of co-production, understanding context, thinking about implementation strategies, and drawing on the evidence about systems change and scaling up challenges. In this session, we hope to explore the meaning of research impact in this context, the ways in which researchers and organisations can work together, and the relationships and boundaries in between research, campaigning, policymaking, and practice. I need to start with apologies from one of our speakers. Dr. Ruth Machin is unfortunately not well and so can't be here, but I'd highly recommend her paper, and I'll paste a link in the chat later on. So to start the session off, I'd like to invite our panelists to spend about 2 minutes each introducing themselves. So briefly outlining your role and your interests in the issue of using evidence to influence policy and practice. And if we start off with Jamie, and then Jane, and then Vanda. Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Lindsay. So yeah, I'm Jamie Evans. I'm a researcher at the Personal Finance Research Centre, based at the University of Bristol. So as our name suggests, we kind of conduct a range of research related to personal finance, mainly looking at it from the perspective of people in financial difficulty in the UK. For the past year, I've also been working part-time as a parliamentary academic fellow at the House of Commons Library. So in that, I've been basically kind of preparing briefing papers for MPs on different topics related to personal finance. And I'd be more than happy to talk to anyone about the fellowship scheme if anyone's interested. So do drop me an email. Yeah, prior to working at Bristol, I worked at a national charity called the Community Development Foundation. So I was thinking I'll kind of try and draw on I guess some of that experience from the charity world in the session today. So yeah, why am I interested in using evidence to inform policy? Well, for me, evidence is ultimately about giving marginalized communities a voice, and it's about revealing, I guess, the reality of the problems that people actually face. And ultimately policies, I think, are more likely to work if they're targeted at actual problems rather than, what policymakers assume to be the problems. So yeah, evidence is really important, and that's why I'm here today.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And Jane?
Schoolboy era. Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Lewis. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join the panel. So I'm Jane Lewis. I'm one of the directors at the Centre for Evidence and Implementation. We are what we would describe as an intermediary organisation, and I think that might be a little bit of a theme in our discussion today. So we work to support governments, NGOs, voluntary sector organisations, services, local governments to use evidence to improve policies, programmes and services for disadvantaged communities. Most of our work is around child and family services, although we work a little more widely than that. And we carry out broadly 3 areas of work. The first is evidence synthesis, so collating the evidence about what has been shown to work in other contexts. Secondly, evaluation, both effectiveness evaluations and also evaluations of implementation, and I'll be banging on about implementation through the panel. And then thirdly, working with governments or systems or organisations, large or small, to plan implementation and think through what effective implementation is going to involve. And our interest in evidence and policy comes sometimes from working directly to influence policy, where we've been commissioned by government or by a systems leader to do precisely that, but sometimes through recognising that policy is a really essential contextual influence on change, whether it's change that's sought by a charity or by a statutory service or by anything else. And we know more and more about the importance of really strong alignment and fit, and the importance of mutual adaptation between intended changes and policy environments. And just to finish off, I came into this space through working for a long time in research and evaluation, doing a lot of evaluation of policies, and struggling to see the policy I was meant to be evaluating actually being visible in practice. And so that's really how I got into implementation and the importance of implementation as a way in which evidence influences policy. So I'll stop at that point.
Brilliant, thank you, Jane. There's yeah, definitely plenty to delve into there. And last but by no means least, Wanda.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thanks again to Lindsay and Eloise and everyone at Bristol for inviting me to what looks like an absolutely fascinating conference over the past couple of days and continuing. So I'm Wanda Popolska, I'm Executive Director at the Equality Trust, and the Equality Trust is the national charity that campaigns, I say campaigns, to tackle inequality, both social and economic inequalities, those intersections. And, you know, at the very heart of our work is evidence. We were founded by Professors Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson at the same time as they released Spirit Level over 10 years ago, with the intention by those academics that their work would become more widely known and would actually be put into practice. So taking that evidence and bringing it to quite literally the world in terms of the impact of inequality and recognizing that then there was a job to do. And I think it's really interesting because from the very start, people contacted the Equality Trust and said, we want to set up local groups, we want to do something on the ground. So we've always had this very strong two-pronged approach, which is working at grassroots level, co-producing with young people, which we've started to do in the last couple of years, and ensuring that we also have that national voice working at national level, which is a very interesting mix you don't often find in organisations. So we have around 20 local groups, and I'm very proud to say that we have a thriving group in Bristol. So if any of you are local, please do get in touch. And we really are, as Jane said, an intermediary group. We like to see ourselves as research translators, taking the research, making it usable and understandable, and I don't mean that in a condescending way, to the wider public. So it may be things like Fat Cat Day, it may be things like doing a gender pay gap calculator, but really pushing home the points in a way that make them understandable in terms of inequality for the wider public, and galvanizing that force. Because we can take evidence, we can take policy to decision makers, but we really need that critical mass of mobilization of campaigning to ensure that there's enough heft behind that for them to start to take notice.
Brilliant, thank you. Wonderful. And yeah, I mean, bearing in mind we are a fairly small group this morning, I wondered whether the audience would like to just write in the chat a brief sort of introduction as well. Maybe let us know where you're from, what organisation you're based in, and what your interests are in this issue. Yeah, it would be nice to sort of know who we have here. So to start us off then, it feels like the issues around inequalities are in the news almost daily, both in the UK and globally as well. So what opportunities do you think there are for policymakers, campaigners and researchers working in this area to work together right now? And if we start off with Jamie, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing I kind of wanted to do was, I guess, reflect on how important this idea of working together really is, because I think we've kind of lived through a bit of a context over the kind of past decade where, you know, funding for third sector organizations has been quite a challenge, and that often pushes people towards more of a kind of competitive model, and you've got lots of different organizations kind of competing to demonstrate their own impact in a way, and there's a danger with that I guess not only do you have a bit of a duplication of effort, but you've also got kind of a lot of mixed messages coming through and like different people saying different things, and that can kind of, I don't know, that can make it harder in a way to get the evidence across to policymakers. And I think this is kind of what Wanda was sort of getting at, that you need that kind of mass mobilization, I think, to really make change happen. And I guess that's where the opportunity lies, I think. You know, things like today, the network, I know that Lindsay, you're kind of thinking about kind of setting up after today, bringing people together, collaborating, the opportunity through COVID in a world where technology makes it easier than ever before to mobilize, we've got to kind of take that opportunity, I guess. So that's a key thing. Yeah, in terms of other opportunities, I know Jane and Vander will have loads to kind of talk about, but I just wanted to reflect on one thing that I, as a researcher, had found really helpful in my time. So I'm more of a quant researcher, and that makes it very easy to kind of stay behind your desk all day and look at numbers and spreadsheets and stuff. And one of the things I found most helpful was going into a debt advice charity and literally listening to phone calls that they have with their clients, and they're kind of people that are seeking help with their debts. I think it's sort of, I don't know, just really illuminating, I guess, in terms of understanding the reality for people in financial difficulty and poverty in the UK, and also getting a bit more of a feel for the way that, I guess, the charities and the debt advisors kind of practically deal with the problems that are in front of them. And I just think, I don't know, there's an awful lot of expertise in those charities in terms of practically dealing with problems. And my take-home message to academics would be that it's really good to kind of experience that, and I think it helps. It helps you make better policy recommendations if you know practically how things work on the ground. Yeah, that's my one takeaway, I guess. There's also the opportunity about kind of incorporating lived experience more at the heart of research design, I think, and working with charities and other kind of intermediaries, I think helps. It's a really good way of reaching people with lived experience and trying to kind of incorporate them in research design and kind of communicating findings. Yeah, which I think is really, really important. Yeah, that's probably all I'll say. I'll hand over to...
Great, thank you, Jamie. And so, did you want to come in there?
Yes, I was just going to say, I mean, I think there are really significant opportunities for evidence to influence policy at the moment, and that for researchers that involves recognizing that we need to be not operating in push mode. In other words, we shouldn't be thinking, why aren't they listening to my evidence? And we should instead be really attentive to the pull factors, because I think that they are many within political systems and within governments, and that they're actually, I mean, I'd say arguably more incentives within government to use evidence than there are perhaps within academia or within research generating contexts to promote and work with policymakers to support the use of evidence in policy making. And we need to be thinking about the next stage on, you know, from push to pull, to thinking about how we can build a system that that supports engagement between research producers and policymakers, and build an infrastructure that that really supports that kind of engagement, because so much of it is relationship based, and so much of it does depend on getting out there, really getting to understand the process of policy making and the constraints on policy making and the kind of serendipity around the number of things that need to come into alignment for evidence to be valuable to policy making. But I mean, I think, you know, when I talk to policymakers, what I hear from them is that what is really valued is sound advice giving, and sound advice giving is very often advice giving that is highly attentive to evidence of a range of different types. That doesn't mean that evidence is the only thing it needs to be attentive to, but I think there are strong incentives within policymaking communities, and some really interesting new ways of nurturing those relationships with things like embedded researchers and fellowships and specialist teams within government that reach out and form relationships with academics and research producers. So I think there's a strong responsibility on us as research generators to get out there and to see what's going on and to really listen and understand what's needed.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of question of relationships is one that we talk about quite a lot when we're working with academics, because there isn't that much strong evidence about what makes policy research engagement work. Apart from it's that sort of mutually trusting, reciprocal, respectful relationships, like knowing, yeah, where the demands are and how our interests line up, I suppose. So that sort of leads us on quite nicely onto a question around, excuse me, what types of partnerships between researchers and intermediary organisations are needed to address inequalities, and what do those good partnerships look like, or maybe not look like, drawing on your experience? And Wanda, maybe you'd like to kick us off there.
Yeah, I'd like to take us slightly back to the previous question, because I think it raises some issues about access. And it really, for me, shows us that although policymakers are, a rather sort of elite group in a sense, then the people who have access to them and can nurture those relationships are also perpetuating that elitism of access. So what we're doing is mediating, what a lot of organizations and academics are doing is mediating the voice from what you might call the clients or beneficiaries of those charities. And I think for me, the really problematic area there is that we have a real dissonance between those people, mostly, I'm not going to stereotype everybody, but mostly it's recognized that there is a huge dissonance between those researchers and people who work in charities and the beneficiaries. And that means their voices are being distorted with the best of intentions through those conduits. So by the time we actually get their voices and their experience through those layers to policymakers, it can look very different. And I think, a really good example of this is with universal credit, where the wrong questions were asked. And so the people making the decisions on when universal credit payments were being made were working on the basis that, of course, everybody gets paid monthly, everybody gets paid a salary. It didn't enter their head because, they had never been in that situation where they were being paid weekly, or to think that people were paid weekly. And that's just one small example of how that dissonance played out. And actually that played out, as many of you will know, with people getting into huge debt because all of a sudden they were going from weekly payments to monthly. So I think we actually really need to be very cognizant of who is doing the research and how it's being done as well. And I think one of the other things is that we almost have this the wrong way round. So we have academics and researchers talking about then going to the sort of beneficiaries or the focus groups or any other groups. And I think in a sense we need to upend that, and we need to start with people and then put our hypotheses or our theories or our methodology on top of that, because again, we are very likely to ask the wrong question, because as Jamie said, just listening into those phone calls is far more illuminating, because why people are in debt, the myriad reasons of what's happened in people's lives. And you cannot, compile a nice, neat flowchart that says, if this happens, that happens, and then this is where we come in, this is the intervention, because life is far more complex and people's circumstances are far more complex. And I think that comes back to the real, what I said at the beginning about mobilizing, is that we know that in countries with high levels of inequality, we also have high levels of poor mental health. We know it affects social determinants of health. We know it affects violent crime, incarceration, education. And so by working in silos on each of these issues and not coming together to work on them, we're just perpetuating the problems of working in silos. So I think this is a huge huge issue for charities, as Jamie alluded to, because the model of funding is competitive. And because there are different ideologies about, different ways to tackle even poverty, for example, many different theories of poverty and how far back poverty organisations are prepared to go to tackle the causes of poverty and not just the impacts. So it's a hugely complex issue. And when you throw academics, third sector, the rest of the voluntary sector as well, let's not forget, the role of trade unions and others, and policymakers, and we also think about the fact that it's very, very difficult at the moment, relatively speaking, to influence this government, but it's a lot easier to get movement at local level. And so thinking about how we influence locally and the growth of funding, for example, for place-based initiatives, I think throws a lot of different factors into the mix.
Thank you, Vanda. Yeah, plenty to think about there in terms of making sure that we're being led by needs of communities rather than leading from researchers' perspectives, I suppose. And that point you made about both researchers and charities coming along with the best of intentions, I think is really worth holding on to, because it sort of raises that question of how we know whether our evidence or whether our actions really made a difference to policy or practice. And do we sort of really think about what the implementation of new ideas might look like, and how do we know how can we measure and plan in that measurement from the start of any intervention? And Jane, this is your area of expertise, I suppose. Would you like to speak about that?
Yes, sure. And I think the focus on implementation is so important, because that really has to be an absolute starting point, so that policy needs to be developed with implementation in mind. And of course we need evidence to understand what those processes of implementation need to be, but I think it's generally a sort of unrecognised area of policy making, and something that in the UK and more widely policymakers are now becoming increasingly alert to. And we get more and more questions from local government, regional government, state governments, national governments in the different countries that we work in, about how policymakers can think about implementation and what policy implementation thinking really involves. And I think that's really recognising that when policies fail, don't achieve the outcomes that they're intended to achieve, that will sometimes be because the policy was simply misguided and wrongly designed, but it will often be because of failures in implementation of the policy, that it was the right policy. And in fact, we see that over and over again, don't we, where 8 years later we're back there with the same policy, or what looks like a remarkably familiar new policy initiative. And it's very often implementation failures that are at the heart of that. And what we're recognizing and learning is that implementation is a thing. It's really active work. It doesn't just happen. It requires analysis and planning and capacity building and active work. And we need to shift from thinking about letting things happen and hoping that they will happen, to actually actively making them happen. And what we're learning is that achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve for communities involves the right intervention, whether that's a policy or a programme or a new service, and the right implementation, and an enabling context, which will often include the broader policy context. And it's only when all of those three buckets are full to some degree that we'll see the results of policy making that we're wanting to see. And that really involves thinking about what are the implementation outcomes that we're working to, what would it look like for this policy to actually be being enacted, and what will it take, and what are the barriers and enablers to that, and what kinds of implementation strategies need to be brought to bear to activate the enablers and to find ways around the barriers. And there's some terrific work going on in the implementation science field about what about the range of implementation strategies that are available, and a recent compilation that identified 73 different strategies, of which training was only one. We so often think that we develop the policy, then we just have to train people, and then Bob's your uncle and it will get done. Actually, training is not a particularly effective implementation strategy unless it's used in the right way for the right reason. And there is a whole range of different implementation strategies that we need to be thinking about. And which ones are needed will vary very much on the context, the nature of the policy and the context in which it's being developed. So if it's something that's sort of highly visionary, highly fluid, highly flexible, then approaches to implementation that involve building capacity, co-production, working together, stakeholder engagement are more likely to be needed. If it's a highly specific policy that comes with a lot of existing incentives, then it may be that a more directive, this is how you do it type approach to implementation is needed. But we need to be doing much more detailed analysis of the political and social environment that policy is going to land in, and really thinking through what those what implementation strategies are going to be needed.
Well, thank you. That sparks off so many questions in my mind. Just a reminder for participants, do pose your questions in the chat or raise a virtual hand if you'd like to ask a question verbally as well. But Jamie, were you about to come in there?
Yeah, I can't remember what I was going to say.
Sorry.
I think on this kind of implementation thing, and it's ultimately about the idea of what works in terms of policy. I just wanted to flag that my colleague, Professor Sharon Collard, she's done some really interesting work on the What Works Fund that is worth Googling. I don't know a huge amount about it, but it was very much about how do you identify what works in terms of policies related to personal finance, and how do you measure their impact? Because I think the evaluation of the policies is really difficult in the real world. It's much harder to do kind of your randomized control trials and have the perfect evaluation in the real world. So yeah, I don't know. I just recommend checking that out if people have time.
Yeah, and it strikes me that question of how do you demonstrate your impact is one that's really shared across academia and charities and non-governmental organisations as well. We're all being asked more and more to sort of show what difference we make, which makes that whole question of knowing how and drawing on the right methods and frameworks and tools for doing that even more critical, really. And that sort of raises the question, because all of these things are quite challenging, like Jane mentioned, needing those three buckets all sort of lined up to properly create change. That can be a fairly tall order, I suppose. So do you think, hoping that we can have a note of optimism here, that we are in this situation where we can realistically create change in policy and practice?
Shall I go? Yeah. I mean, it depends what mood I wake up in, but I'm feeling good today. So yes, we can make change. Yeah, it feels like we're at a bit of a turning point, I guess, in terms of attitudes to things like welfare and poverty in the UK. So I think there's a survey published last year that showed more people in the UK now think that benefits are too low than too high. And that's something that's been changing a lot in recent years. COVID has probably led to a situation where the public are probably more ready to accept kind of state intervention than they might have been before. So that's maybe helpful in terms of tackling some of these big issues. So yes, we can create change, but it's not necessarily always easy. And this is, I think, where Ruth Macken would have been really good to have had on the call today, because I was kind of looking at some of what she's written in terms of how do you make sure that your evidence actually affects policy. And one of the things that leapt out of her paper on some of the issues was this idea that she calls it ideological fracturing of evidence, and the fact that when you give your evidence to someone, they're not a blank slate. They're coming at it with their own preconceptions, and they kind of hear what they want to hear, I guess. And there's a quote in her paper from Michael Marmot, who observes that scientific findings do not fall on blank minds that get made up as a result. Science engages with busy minds that have strong views about how things are and ought to be. And I was just thinking that's kind of really relevant in terms of, yeah, how do you make your evidence kind of land? You have to adapt the way that you frame it, I think, in order to change people's minds. And yeah, there's various evidence out there, I think, various research about how do you communicate findings in a way that that might help people change their minds. I think the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have done stuff on the framing of poverty, and how often framing poverty in relation to the concept of fairness often doesn't work. You might think it does, and that it should be, I don't know, I guess it's kind of moral idea that it's not fair that some people have quite difficult lives, or whatever you might think. But it's that, yeah, that doesn't always land well, because people are then like, well, it's not fair that I have to pay my taxes to fund their lifestyle, like you get that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but the point is that often I think the campaigns that have been really successful are things like kind of Marcus Rashford and his kind of coalition tackling food poverty in the UK. That's really worked because you've got someone with lived experience bringing a whole load of people and organizations together with one voice and framing it in a way that that resonates with people. And that's kind of what we need to be doing more of, I think.
I think if I can just pop in here as well, I think what Jamie's saying is absolutely right, and I think it really emphasises the range of different types of evidence that make up science, and the range of different types of evidence that we need to be attentive to, and we need to be thinking about using and bringing together to influence political systems and policy making. And although high quality randomized controlled trials showing what has worked in other settings is a really important part of that, so as Jamie highlights is lived experience, and so is a really rich understanding of the context in which you want to perhaps transport or bring something in that has worked effectively somewhere else, and the importance of really nuanced understanding of how this context is different from that context, and how the evidence-informed policy or practice or whatever it is might therefore need to be adapted and refined to fit better to a new context. And we're understanding more and more that context is just absolutely critical. I think also what Jamie says also highlights for me the importance of not thinking of evidence or science as a kind of artifact that's unchanging. Actually, what's really, really interesting about evidence is the way in which it's reframed, enriched, re-understood when it's brought to different stakeholders and when they make their own sense of it. You know, evidence never speaks for itself, data never speak for themselves. And it's that process of co-producing meaning from evidence that I think we need to really, really embrace, and not be worried about whether people will understand things in the way that we want them to understand them, and more to kind of work so that we are together developing a richer understanding of the meaning of evidence in a particular context or for a particular purpose. And, you know, a range of different forms of evidence come into play at that point.
Mm.
But I think it's really important as well, as Jamie alluded to, that I don't think the success of the Rashford campaign was anything to do with framing or, you know, a difference in that. It was Marcus Rashford. You know, many organisations and people have been going on about this for decades. But I think, again, it comes back to the importance of who has the public or political or social heft and standing to really make a fuss and to get a different constituency around this issue. Obviously, the people who follow Marcus Rashford and the people who, you know, see him as, you know, a footballing hero or whatever, depends what team you support, I suppose, aren't the sorts of people that would be writing to MPs and writing to their local paper about policy and practice, to be quite honest. So it is about how we tap into that very public arena, and that very much is about the who, not necessarily, you know, the evidence in a sense, because, you know, in terms of children going hungry or going to food banks, that's pretty stark evidence. You know, you don't really need to nuance that or frame that. There are, of course, people, as Jamie said, who will say, you know, whose ideology of poverty is it's your own fault. You know, if you can't pull yourself up by the bootstraps and create a business and become a millionaire and live this fantastic neoliberal dream, then it is your own fault. So I think it was really important to think about the moment as well, because we've seen the government now introduce much more policy and a strategy on health inequalities. Because finally, COVID has shown them that actually social issues are related to health inequalities, that income is related to health inequalities. And so, you know, the people that we have been, you know, we've been banging on the door for decades talking about these issues, but it can very often take a moment, an event, or a person to galvanize a campaign. And that's nothing to do with the evidence, in a sense, because the evidence has been there. I mean, I do agree with Jane's point that the different ideas of what constitutes evidence, but sometimes it just takes that moment, which is serendipitous and nothing we can control, that means that there's an opening. And at that point, you know, there is political will. And I think we have to recognize the role of political will here, because very often we hear, you know, new institutions being set up, new evidence is being given, evidence is being gathered in order to change policy. And I'm afraid it doesn't always work that way. We don't, if we had a beautiful system whereby we produced the evidence and the evidence showed if we did X, Y would improve, and we went to the government and we went to policymakers and they said, yes, that's great, and it happened, you know, that would be fantastic. But we know that there is more political nuance to that. And so, you know, we cannot put all of our faith in evidence. We do need the campaigning, we do need the profile, and we do also need to show that it works as well.
Mm. Thank you all, really, really valuable contributions there. I'd like to pass over to Eloise now and see whether there are any questions in the chat or raised hands from the audience. So, yeah, Eloise.
Thanks, Lindsay. There's a couple of questions that have come through in the chat. So if I start with those, and if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to raise your hand or use the chat function. We had a question early on from Amal Kakari, and Karaki, sorry, and that was on international development assistance. If it's okay with you, Amal, I might wait and do your question after one that was posed by Becky Launchbury, which I think follows on quite closely from the discussion we've just been having. And she talks about her interest in knowledge exchange elements and how researchers and non-academic organisations can work together to formulate those questions and co-create methodologies. And so just to sort of pose to the panel their views about, you know, what enables that successful collaboration? How do we go about addressing the dissonance that Wanda talked about around the people with the lived experience and bringing them into the research without feeling like they're being, you know, feeling that it's meaningful without feeling they're being researched on. So whether you have any examples or whether you can talk a little bit about sort of what you think would be a successful collaboration, and also what things might be unhelpful. That's a question from Becky.
I think, sorry, I'll have to jump in there. I mean, I think what isn't successful is receiving, as we did when the research councils put out a load of money for COVID research, is writing to organisations and saying, we want to put a bid in, we'd like you to be on the advisory group, this is the bid, and by the way, we need an answer and your approval by, you know, 3 days hence. And I can understand, you know, why organisations do that, and we're all in a terrible rush, but it really, really doesn't help us. And I think in terms of charities, we don't always have the capacity, but also we do actually need paying for our time. I'm going to be very upfront about that. The number of times we get asked to sit on advisory panels, oh, it's only three meetings a year. Well, actually, it's the prep for that meeting. It's, you know, taking part in the meeting. And if we're doing that for 6 or 7 projects, that is a lot of time. So I would say, you know, develop a relationship with an organisation before you start to put bids in. Make a tiny bit more effort. And I would say the relationship we have with Bristol is absolutely exemplary and a really good example of that. Of having a good relationship, sorry, because, you know, we are talking about ways in which we can work together in a co-produced way. And I want to come back to this point because, again, you know, what we're doing is saying, as academics, we're doing our research and then we're going to bring people in. And again, it's setting that parameter of, this is our project, we're in charge, and we need you for this bit. You know, it should be more of a mosaic, in a sense, of working with people and then considering, okay, so what direction is this research going to take? Rather than, you know, we just need to have our focus groups, we need to do that. I've seen that so many times. And that way, you do start to ask the right questions. And I keep coming back to asking the right questions because it's absolutely fundamental. So really working with communities in an honest, authentic, and rewarding way for them, rather than sort of cherry picking people when you're getting to that point in your research. And I think really, I mean, we are, as Lindsay will talk about, setting up an academic network precisely for this point so that we can develop these relationships. And we can also support academics to work with communities as well, because we work on the ground, we work with a range of organisations. We're currently doing a COVID research project, which is about bringing the lived experience of COVID and inequality to complement the academic work. You know, we're not saying the academic work doesn't need to be done, clearly, but we do need, and we know from working with parliamentary groups, from running the APG on poverty with CPAG, that people coming and talking about their experience still moves politicians and others in a way that you don't get from a research paper. So making sure that we have both aspects of that and widening that sphere of evidence as well that Jane was talking about.
Thank you, Wanda. And unless Jane or Jamie have anything really urgent they want to say, oh, Lindsay does.
Sorry, no, I just thought now would be a good moment to flag up that the network that Wanda mentioned. We're interested in creating a network of researchers and organisations interested in reducing inequalities. So I'll post a link in the chat, which is here. Please, oh, no, that's the wrong person. Please do put in your details if you'd be interested in finding out more. As Wanda mentioned, we've not made a really clear direction about we will do these things. We'd be interested in finding out what we would all gain from the network first. So yeah, do sign up if you're interested in that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, if it's okay with the other panelists, I'm going to move on and take Amal's question, because he did get in there very early when we were introducing ourselves, and I suppose a lot of the discussion has been focused on the UK, understandably given the panelists, but he had a question around the government cuts affecting international development assistance, and I suppose it speaks to your point earlier, Jane, about how we understand the process of policy making and all the different sort of aspects that are involved in that. So it was just whether any of the panelists wanted to give any of their views on the government cuts affecting international development assistance.
I mean, I would just say, obviously, I don't think it's a good thing. Yeah, I think it's a long-term damaging thing for the UK and for the world, I guess. And actually, I think coming back to the point about kind of how do you frame this kind of policy, I guess, in a way that is, I don't know, in a way that might resonate with people. So we've had, I think I saw kind of Gordon Brown I think he managed to frame the idea of the UK giving more aid to India in terms of vaccines and stuff like that. At the moment, Gordon Brown's framing it as it's more of an investment for the UK, if you get what I mean. It's like, it's not a good thing for the UK if India is suffering. So I don't know, I think the way that he framed that was probably quite an effective way of convincing the public that it is a good thing to do out of self-interest as much as out of moral kind of, moral reasons for doing it. I don't know, that's all I'd say really.
Thanks very much, David.
I heard a really effective way this morning on a radio interview, which was quantifying it, and was saying that this will lead to, I think it was 250,000 maternal deaths, and will lead to, I think it was 250,000, I'm sorry, I can't remember the figures, or more unwanted pregnancies. And so, actually being able to then visualize those girls, those women, the effect on their lives, I think is far more effective in a sense for many people than arguing for self-interest. Because in effect, what we're saying is, if we help India now, then it's better for us. And some ways, sometimes that is the way to get policy through, because we know that when there were decisions being made about the importance of domestic violence and abuse, when it was pointed out that actually it costs the economy, I think it was something like 60 million or something like that, then people started to take notice. So sometimes you have to take the sheer economic value of some of the things that are happening to change people's minds, because in a sense, people can't afford not to. And that's, that is heartbreaking in a sense to think in that way, but sometimes that is the way that is effective. So it is finding those different ways of framing it, as you said, Jamie, to different audiences. There is no one way of framing a problem that will appeal to everybody. It's using different language, different examples, and different ways of framing for different audiences to hopefully come to the same solution, I think.
Thanks very much. And Jane, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Or I can move on to the next question.
Well, I mean, as you've both said, it is so odious that really let's take any lines we can to challenge it, and let's use all the different forms of evidence that exist to to articulate what the need and the impact of withdrawing funding is. It's also a really lost opportunity for learning. There is so much that other political systems are doing and trying and experimenting with and achieving that we can learn from. And at this particular point, to be closing barriers rather than opening minds seems particularly unhelpful.
Thank you. And please, Amal, my apologies for referencing you as a man. I really apologise for that. That's really terrible of me. So apologies for that. I hope that's answered your question. One final question then that we have from Joanna Mack, and let me just find it in the chat. And it sort of leads on from some of the discussion we've been having. Joanna asked if we had any thoughts, or if the panelists had any thoughts on the role of the media in mediating policy evidence, and whether this can be distorting, either, I suppose, in a positive way or in a negative way, and if there's any thoughts on how we might try and influence that or work alongside that. So yeah, I don't know if any of the panelists wants to take that question.
Well, again, I'd come back to the importance of relationships, just as we were saying about the importance of building relationships between academics and charities or campaigning organisations, and seeing those as being long-term relationships. That's just as important with working with representatives from the media, and working together to understand how to make evidence compelling. I have to say, as a research generator, I feel desperately humble about my abilities to make evidence compelling, and I'm very, very often struck by the wisdom and the insight and the creative thinking that media representatives and other people bring to that process. And so again, it's about recognizing that we simply cannot do this on our own, that there are a number of different sort of forms of expertise and talent and different ways of thinking that need to come together, and developing relationships that build understanding and mutual trust and mutual respect, rather than seeing media as kind of somehow unhuman channels that are just to be kind of operationalized and used and exploited, as that approach simply won't work.
Thank you, Jane. Lindsay, can I just check on you how we're doing for time?
Yeah, we've got about 3 minutes left, so yeah.
So thank you to people who posed additional questions in the chat. Dave Gordon and Graham Burville have both posed some questions. I'm not sure we're going to have time to tackle them, unfortunately, because they're quite detailed. So if it's okay with the group, I'd like to pass back to the panelists to see if there's any sort of final comments that they'd like to make, or any sort of takeaways that they'd like to share following what's been a really insightful and interesting discussion.
I mean, I guess I would emphasise two things which I think have been emphasised across the discussion today. The first is the importance of relationships that are mutually trusting, mutually respectful, that recognise that none of us can do this on our own, that each of us, even where we work in kind of boundary spanning organisations, that each of us are somewhat constrained by our contexts, and that it's by working in partnership that we can achieve more. And the second is the importance of understanding context, whether it's the social context or the political context or the service context and the implementation context, and really richly understanding that and thinking about how we adapt and flex to fit that.
Thank you, Jane. Jamie or Vanda, any last words that you'd like to say?
I'll just say I agree with Jane.
Excellent, thank you.
I think I'll just quickly pick up on the profile on media and social point, which I think is becoming much more of a sort of conduit in a sense. If you have a campaign and you have a high profile person, you are going to get the media coverage. I remember being a press officer and realising that the Daily Mirror was not going to do anything unless we had a celebrity on a story. And that can be incredibly powerful, working with media on long-term campaigns, if you think about the Stephen Lawrence campaign or many others. So I think sometimes we have to remember to make the evidence accessible. and whether that is to really hone in on one or two points, or to, you know, and to adapt that message for different audiences. And I think it's just bearing in mind those different audiences. And again, you know, that plea to work with people, because it sounds very basic, but it's not done enough.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you so much to Jane and Jamie and Vanda and Eloise and the participants for posing such interesting questions. I've found it a really fascinating discussion, and I hope you have too. So many thanks for your time, and we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much.